Hello, BookTube. You know, one of the many, many things that I love about BookTube, this strange phenomenon that has emerged on the gigantic platform of YouTube that I don't think YouTube is aware of, this weird, strange community that has developed. I love many, many things about this community. I love the fact that it is an easy, cost-free doorway to simply adding benefits to your life, to adding people and recommendations and fun to your life. But one of the things I love about it is that I get to listen to the thoughts and the reactions, the opinions, the readings, the offhand gripes of hundreds of readers, dedicated readers. I would not have had access to those before, especially now that I'm not working at my information desk at a retail bookstore. Even if I were working at a retail bookstore's information desk, it wouldn't be the way my information desk was. Well, that was in the pre-internet days, the pre-search engine days, when the world beat a path to that information desk in order to have these kinds of conversations. Once you got to know the customer, the thing about BookTube videos is that get to know you period doesn't exist. All you have to do is subscribe to a channel. So if you watch a video and you think, I want to know what this person's reading life is like, just hit subscribe, and you will get dispatches from that reading life until BookTube burns them out and they disappear. I swear, it's BookTube doing that and not me. But I think that's absolutely fascinating. I love the whole gamut of it, of that intimate element of BookTube. I love the whole gamut of it. From people who keep very much an arm's length distance between themselves and that process. Not everyone embraces that. So some people will do infrequent but regular videos and never interact at all in any way with anyone. They will usually turn down all invitations to buddy reads or events. They won't do tags. They don't ever look in their comment section. Some people react that way, and then all the way at the other end of the spectrum, there are people who respond to every comment that they can, who send books in the mail, who invite people over to their homes. So we see everything on the spectrum. I get your reactions to the latest books that you're reading, the latest books that you're rereading, to what you experienced at your thrift shop, and do they have a particular book stickering habit or book placement habit that annoys you? Well, then you're going to vent for 10 minutes on your video. That's what this is for. And I get to hear it, which I consider to be an incredible privilege. I know that sounds really dorky, but I do. And I was noticing this. I mean, I always think this way. BookTube is by far the biggest thing that I watch on YouTube. I watch a lot. I watch everything. I watch, well, a prime example of how much I love this particular element of learning about, because the people on BookTube aren't just readers. They're the biggest readers. They're the ones who made reading, as I've said many times, an active, regular part of their life. Look at some of the BookTubers that you watch. Some of them have kids. Some of them work nonstop. Some of them take classes. They still make time to read. That's rare. Even people who call themselves readers out in the world don't usually do that. So to get the wide gamut of bookish thoughts and feelings and reactions and whatnot from those readers is incredibly valuable to me. And you can tell how valuable it is by the fact that a significant portion of the BookTube that I watch is made by people who I know either don't like me or who would tell themselves they don't like me if they watched a single video. So there's no reciprocity for a large amount of these things. I watch actively every week videos from people who think I'm a monster. They don't know anything about me. They haven't done me the courtesy of coming here to Hyde Cottage for wine and calzones, after which point, like so many of you have done, you would know for sure that I am a monster. Instead, they're just speculating. That's how much I love it. So you can imagine how much more I love it when I see somebody giving me a sort of a think piece video. A personal reaction, yes, but something that they've put some thought into, something that isn't just, they write the price on the back cover and it annoys me. I still want to hear that. I still think that stuff is fascinating. And the reason this was on my mind is because I got 3 of those think piece videos in a very short amount of time, just recently on BookTube. And I wanted to talk about all 3 of them. I wanted to sort of ping a response to all 3 of them. I'll leave links to all 3 down below. They're 3 of my favorite BookTube channels. The first was Greg at Another Bibliophile Reads. Greg and I are co-hosts for Garb August. And he recently did a video about why he is leaving Goodreads and not going back. And it was fascinating. It was basically boiled down to, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. He was posting to Goodreads. He was using Goodreads the way I suspect a lot of you do. I make very little use of Goodreads. I always kick myself about that. Maybe I'll kick myself a little less now that I've seen Craig's video, but I always kick myself because Goodreads is where all the readers go. And I want to know what they're doing. I want to see what that community... I should know more about that community than I do. I should be more involved. Every single year, I tell myself, this will be the year when you log everything you read on Goodreads, when you leave at least a 1-sentence review of everything on Goodreads, no matter where you review it elsewhere. And I just never managed to do it. I just, that where you reach out. Every once in a while, I make a mental note to go to Goodreads and at least accept every friend request. But I couldn't tell you how many friends I have. And I don't think I've ever asked, I don't think I've ever made a friend request, and that's terrible. I should be doing that. It should be as active a part of my social media life, certainly as any other social media site. It's a social media site made for books, made for readers. But maybe not in Greg's case. Because he listed, I forget the exact category. I think the category that he mentioned first is that for Goodreads, he uses it the way a lot of you do, as a record of his reading, as a database, a repository for his own personal database. He mentions in his video that he started out with just paper and pencil. I imagine a lot of you did. And then moved on and have adopted Goodreads as the place where you document your reading. I've always been a little leery of that. Honestly, I think Greg's original approach is the best one. Keep a reading journal. If that's what you're going to do, keep a reading journal. Instead of using someone else's servers, and if those servers go dark, or if they decide they don't like you, as we're going to see in my response to Greg's video, you lose all of that? That's always given me the willies. But he mentioned that I think it was the Great Books lecture series that he listened to. And he listed those on Goodreads. And some Goodreads, I think the data custodians on Goodreads are called librarians. I think he mentioned that someone on Goodreads just deleted that. They took a look at that and deleted that. That they looked at it and thought, well, that's not real. That doesn't really count for your books total. And just got rid of it. They didn't ask him to take it down. They took it down themselves. And he was chapped about that, as I think anybody would be. I didn't know that such things had happened on Goodreads. And then he did it again. He posted, I think, audiobooks. Oh, right. It was Audible. The audiobook company, Audible, also sponsors and offers audiobook originals. So things that are audiobook productions, but that have never been printed books or digital books. They've never had a text version at all. And Greg is a big fan of audiobooks, and he listed some of those. And after a while, a Goodreads librarian likewise deleted them. Now, Greg mentions in his video that both those cases raised a ruckus on Goodreads, and in both cases, Goodreads reversed themselves and allowed people to repost that material. But he points out that when he was a systems, overseer, he couldn't have done any of that without permission, and that it would have been weird. It would have been weirdly authoritarian to do something like that. And for this to happen on a site devoted to reading, in other words, to keeping an open mind, it's what eventually disenchanted him completely, and he just left the site. And in his video, I watched the video. I thought 2 things. Number one, I immediately wanted to know about you. Have you had nightmare experiences with Goodreads? Of course, in all 3 of these videos, there's hovering over any video that you watch where a bookish person is basically taking the time to give their opinions on something. In any video like that, hovering over it is going to be the slight hint of disagreement with something. Right? Audiobooks have caused a lot of disagreement in our serried ranks. For instance, I disagree completely with people who just make a blanket statement. Greg, I think, has said something equivalent. Sarah at the Bookish Knitter states it outright, that audiobooks are reading. period, full stop. When that is obviously not true. Unless words don't have any meaning, then that is obviously not true. But audiobooks are a way of consuming a book. They are absolutely a way of consuming a book. They absolutely count towards any kind of a bookish total, and they obviously belong on any kind of a bookish inventory. But it's not that. That was the specter of disagreement hovering over this. Of course, I don't listen to audiobooks, so maybe I would think differently if they were a huge part of how I consume books. I don't think it makes all that much of a difference. I think that people who love audiobooks may be a little insecure about that fact. You are definitely consuming a book, but you are definitely not reading a book unless words have no meaning. Just that kind of, in this case, benevolent gaslighting in the 21st century always bothers me. I find that as the 21st century goes on, it bothers me more, not less. I'm not getting used to it. I'm getting more and more reactionary to it. The gaslighting trend of the 21st century, which is to point at something that you know, an indisputable fact of reality that you know, and saying, that isn't true, it never was true, you're not actually even seeing that thing. That whatever it is, that drives me nuts. Especially since in this case, it's a distinction without a difference, I think. So if that was the specter of disagreement that was hovering over Greg's video, but oh my God, the big agreement that I had with him. One reaction was to ask have you ever had anything like this, anything this high-handed happen to you from Goodreads? The other reaction that I had was wholehearted, hands-in-the-air agreement with a point that he makes circumspectly, because Greg does everything circumspectly, but which is absolutely true, which is that if some Goodreads librarian can come along, look at something on your Goodreads page and say, that doesn't really count as a book. Well, okay, as Greg says, no matter what you think about audiobooks, that ought to creep you out. It ought to outrage you. What if that same librarian went over your Goodreads page, saw, get all these anti-vax books, or maybe all these pro-Trump memoirs. Those don't really count. I'm going to remove them. That's unbelievable. That would be outrageous. And there is no difference between the two things. It's not like Greg was listing cars. There's no difference between those two things. So he's right to point that out. I had no idea that kind of high-handed censorship was going on Goodreads. I'd love to know if it's happened to you. And then from another Bibliophile Reads, we move on to CriminOlly, to Ollie at CriminOlly, who did a video after my own heart, in which he inquires into the indisputable reality that in the popular imagination, some creative art forms, even if let's say some literary art forms, are just seen as inherently better than some other literary art forms, right down the line. So you would start with the granddaddy of all literary art forms, epic poetry, or by extension, poetry just in general. I should point out that that is not the great granddaddy of writing. If we were to do the great granddaddy of writing, it would be bookkeeping. but the great granddaddy of creative writing, definitely, it's poetry, epic poetry, non-epic poetry. And then, so that is seen as inherently better than fiction, but fiction can be seen as inherently better than, for instance, comic books. And Ollie makes a great point in his video that maybe a strong element as to why that is true simply has to do with the antiquity of each individual kind of thing, each individual kind of writing. That the older a thing is, the longer humans have been dealing with it and doing it, the more that it's just inherently granted a kind of superior status. I loved watching it because, of course, Ollie has a huge reach. So lots and lots of people are going to see that video and start to think about it. Maybe even start to examine their own prejudices. Until I watched this video, did I think that comic books, or by extension romance novels or science fiction novels, were inherently inferior to a gigantic 900-page experimental novel or something like that? A lot of people will stop and examine that. That's one of the reasons I love the video. And another reason I loved it, of course, is because I've been harping on this forever myself. I've been harping on this since long before there was a BookTube. And also long before there was a YouTube, and long before there was an internet. And as far as I can calculate, also about 15 years longer than there was an Ollie, which is that there is no such thing as a hierarchy of creative expression. There is no such thing. That does not exist. It's not that it's this instead of that. It's that that idea is wrong. That idea has been around forever to support snobbery because, unfortunately, snobs have been around forever. But there is no such thing as a hierarchy of aesthetic creations. That doesn't exist. There is no table that says, well, epic poetry up here, lyric poetry right here, heavily resourced 800-page histories here, heavily resourced 800-page biographies, maybe a fraction below that, fiction down here, but certain kinds of fiction are up here and other kinds of fiction are down here. Then you've got the genre stuff, and then down below here you've got, I don't even know, porn, comic books, graphic novels, that sort of thing. That people have been alluding to that hierarchy as long as people have been creative, and it is false. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. There is no hierarchy of creative expression. All there is the execution of each kind of thing. So romances, for instance, romance novels, which are all ordinarily seen by the general reader, although not really by BookTube, by the general public and the general kind of person who would call themselves a reader, read maybe 4 books a year. That is, that's significantly above average, but that is those people would consider themselves readers. I know some of those. I know some of those people. They have the best intentions in the world. 4 books a year, 5 books a year. They're usually incredibly busy. One of them, actually 4 of them that I know work in television. And 2 of them work, let's just say, in front of the camera. You'd be amazed. Once you see what their daily and weekly schedule is like, you're amazed they read it all. They do. They just don't read much. Very little compared to us. And those people would probably just reflexively say, oh, well, a romance novel, what do you expect? A romance novel is, in its very nature, going to be less than an 800-page biography. When that's not true. The only gradations here is how well is that romance novel done versus how well is that 800-page biography done. I read an 800-page biography of a very famous writer not just a few years ago. That was terrible. Absolutely terrible. It did not benefit from any imagined hierarchy. It was terrible. The same week that I read that biography, I read a Joanna Shupe romance novel set in the Regency era, and it was much better. It was a much better book because it's all about execution. It's all about how you do it. It's not about what it is. You don't get to climb a ladder. All you get to do is run a race. That was the second video, and then the third video that I'm talking again. I will try to remember to link all of these down below. Was AP over at Chasing Dragons, Critical Dragon. And I mentioned Critical Dragon before on this channel. It's a wonderfully thoughtful channel. Carefully reasoned, eloquently put, very soft-spoken, non-confrontational, much like this channel. But this is probably closest to my heart because he did a video about pretension and what it means. Some of his thoughts on pretension. I swear, if you don't know AP's channel, if you don't know Critical Dragon, and you see a title of one of his videos that says "Some Thoughts On," oh my, click right away, because some YouTubers and some BookTubers will make a title like that. They'll say "Some Thoughts On," and it's a wandering, formless, shallow bagatelle of silly little reactions. Now, when AP does it, it's real. It's wonderful, and yet, hovering over his video, there was, once again, the specter of disagreement. Mainly stemming from one particular bugbear of Steve's, which we'll get to, but he was talking about some of the different places where we might perceive pretension. What is pretension? How do you know it when you see it? And what are some of the ways that you could maybe think you're seeing it when you're really not? So he mentioned, for instance, vocabulary size. Which is exactly the kind of weird, thought-provoking angle that you don't see coming when you watch one of his videos. He mentioned vocabulary size. He invokes Shakespeare and Shakespeare's legendary vocabulary, but he also mentions, for instance, a toddler would be reading at a certain level, and if you read it, you with your, your 25,000 word vocabulary, you would read at that level and think, well, this isn't challenging for me at all. If you read someone at your own vocabulary level, you might think this is straight on. And if you read someone at Shakespeare or Kierkegaard's vocabulary level, you would think this is well over my head. AP mentions that, he makes reference to a recent study that somewhat sarcastically pointed out that the reading level of UK newspapers has dropped over the decades to the point where it is now, where it's a grade school reading level. Which is certainly true for the American press as well. And that maybe, the idea here being that maybe you might perceive someone as pretentious who is merely using a greater vocabulary than you possess. And another possible origin of a mistake, an idea of pretension, would be the usage of the day. AP mentions the famous Dear Sarah, the famous American Civil War letters that soldiers wrote home to their loved ones, in that, the famous copperplate that was made into a national fad by Ken Burns' documentary, The Civil War, where the diction is beautiful, the writing is, the sentiments are beautifully phrased and whatnot. And AP points out that, that was how people wrote letters at the time, and it only looks pretentious if the times have changed. And he points out always in his videos there is a substrata of advice about writing fantasy, and he mentions that that is a tool that you can use in writing fantasy to set a character's diction apart by intentionally archaicizing it that way. I might quibble about that just a little. Yes, it's true to look at the usage of the day and how that usage changes, but also the attitudes of the day. And in the attitudes of the day, writing, if your parents had spent, $50 whole on your education, then you would strike a tone in formal letters that you wouldn't strike in ordinary conversation. I think it would be a little bit of a mistake to read those letters as the way their writers sounded. But I don't think that he was going heavy on that direction. I think he was just pointing instead to the usage of the time. And then his third and worst point for me was authorial intent. That maybe the author is trying to write something in a different way. Maybe they're combining one and two in order to try and write something in a different way. And you can't hold that against them as pretension. You can't chalk that up to pretension. And all of those things together, you can see where this is going. You can see what Steve Bugboo this is headed towards. And that is my number one bugaboo, which is it's all subjective. I hate that so much. When it applies to writing, I hate that so much. It is not all subjective. You could watch Critical Dragon's video and come away from it thinking there isn't any such thing as actual pretension. He doesn't mean you to do that. I don't think he does. I think the reason he's bringing up these three things, and he could have brought up 3 more or 6 more, is to show the different factors that go into what we may reflexively consider pretension, and that you should think about those factors as a reader and also as a writer before you call something pretentious, which is good. That kind of precaution is good, but I want to stress that this is not all subjective, and that something can be very, very pretentious. That is entirely possible to do. It is entirely possible to be pretentious. And I think the defining characteristic of pretension, how you know it when you see it, is the one that comes up a couple of times in AP's video, which is that the writer is showing off. The writer is trying to condescend by showing off. I think that comes out loud and clear in most cases of pretension. Loud and clear. And it obviously has nothing to do with, as AP himself points out, it has nothing to do with the size of vocabulary. I would argue it also has nothing to do with the usage of the day. There are plenty of pretentious. The Civil War was fought in the 1860s. There are plenty of pretentious writers in the 1860s. Plenty of them. They're using the same diction as that soldier writing home to my dear Sarah. They're using the same diction, the same biblical reference, the same everything. But they're not writing from the heart. They're not writing honestly. They are trying to be pretentious. That is absolutely true. AP mentions in his video that some people just have bigger vocabularies than others, and it's not meant as a parlor showpiece. They use it every day. their vocabulary is an active mechanism that's always changing, and they can't help the fact that it's large. I have experienced that plenty of times, and you can also experience it yourself. You can experience the writings of someone who is littering their page with erudition without the slightest hint of pretension. Much as I hate to give it to him, I would absolutely say this about Harlan Ellison, the American science fiction writer Harlan Ellison, who spent the last 20, 30 years of his life writing about anything but science fiction. He wrote editorials and columns and stuff like that. Pull down your big, fat, essential Ellison and read through it. You will see someone who has an enormous vocabulary, at least the size of Shakespeare's, and is using it completely naturally. Doesn't even think about it. Isn't even thinking about whether or not you have to look up a word. He's not even thinking about that. Hugh Kenner was the same way. It's a differential in some people that doesn't at all necessitate pretension. Whereas find some young man between the ages of 18 and 25 who's a big fan of Jordan Peterson. Find his, blog, and read some of it. You'll see that pretension is alive and well. It is alive and well. It is talking all about its ipseity. Do you know what that word means? Do I? Does anybody? Does that person ever use the word? No. It's meant to brandish. It's meant to brag. I think pretension is a very real thing. It is a very real thing. That's the one counterpoint that I would make. And I'm sure that Critical Dragon would say the same thing. Of course it's real, or he couldn't make a video about it. What he was trying to do was as he always does, to add nuance. Actually, all three of these videos were meant to add nuance, to raise discussion, and that's what I want to do. I want to throw these things out to the rest of you. So, for Ollie's video, are you guilty, maybe? If you're being honest, are you guilty of actually reflexively thinking that there is a hierarchy of creative endeavors? Are you guilty of that? When someone says to you, if someone were to say to you, if you were to encounter two people in the line at the avocado smoothie bar, and one were to say that he's a professional biographer, and the other one were to say that he's a professional pornographer, that he writes porn for a living, are you guilty of believing that there is a hierarchy of aesthetic creations? I would love to hear that. And for Greg's video, Another Bibliophile Reads, definitely I want to hear your stories about Goodreads. Have you been screwed over by Goodreads? Have you reached the point? Well, maybe a lot of you haven't reached the point that Greg has of simply walking away. But I'd really like to know if the rest of you will you at least reassure me that you keep a book list analog that doesn't involve Goodreads. That would really set my heart at ease. And also for Critical Dragons, I would love to know what your thoughts are on pretension. I'm pretty sure that we can all agree, and I don't mean to mischaracterize AP's video. I'm sure that he agrees as well. The pretension can be done. It is real. It's not just a question of vocabulary size or misunderstanding. It does exist. How much of a factor of his nuances do you think plays a part? Have you ever read a work from, for instance, the middle of the 18th century and thought, oh, that's really pretentious, and then caught yourself and realized, oh, that everybody wrote that way back then? Or do you know pretension when you see it? Do you know when somebody's trying to show off? Trying to make you feel dumb? And also, I'd love to know when you see that, when you encounter that kind of pretension, is it a deal breaker? I'm pretty much a professional reader. I'm a professional book critic, so I don't have the luxury of deal breakers. I have a sweet kind of revenge, which is that if somebody does something that in the normal course of events would be a deal breaker for me, I get to call them out on it. But if I weren't that, pretension would be a deal breaker for me. The minute I encountered it, there's no way to fix it, and there's no way to recover from it either. It's a nosedive. If an author is pretentious on page 3, then it's not going to be your best buddy on page 300. So for me, it would be a deal breaker, and I'm wondering if it is for you. But anyway, this is I could do this every day, I swear, because every day I encounter videos like this. In this wonderful, weird thing that we have, where we're all talking to each other about books. Not only specific books, what we're reading, but also just books in general. Here's a classic of the Western canon. I've just encountered it for the first time, so I'm going to do a review about it, talk about it a bit. Here's a book that maybe isn't yet in the Western canon. It's an early 20th century work. I love it so passionately that I've read it 50 times. I'm going to talk about it again. I know I've talked about it a million times on this channel. I'm going to talk about it again. And so on and so forth down the line. How amazing. All these multiple conversations that we're having. So I wanted to string these three together because all three of them fascinate me. But that will quite do for my nattering. So I will wrap this up for now. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.